This is The Lonely Voice with Peter Orner from Book Public on Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. And as with our last episode of The Lonely Voice, we're fortunate to have with us special guest Alberto Reyes Morgan to help us discuss Remember by Juan Rulfo. This is a bonus episode for a very short story of just a few pages. However, as we've seen in our previous three offerings about Juan Rulfo's work, there's a lot to say. At the center of Remember is the refrain from the first-person narrator to some listener, a contemporary of his who went to school with him and should be aware of every incident that's recalled, every person named and described, every sad situation unearthed from the mothballs of memory. Remember, he says over and again, while himself, as we'll see, showing evidence that time has blunted the edges of his recall. The vagaries of his mind emerge in details that are by turns vivid or vague. What is certain is that something terrible has occurred. Urbano's childhood was already fraught. One single event from the 5th grade stands as some kind of unfortunate touchstone. This one time when Urbano ended up humiliated, so disgraced that he vowed a kind of revenge. The narrator wants us to remember it as he leads us to a story about an act by Urbano that is dark and unspeakable, and also inexplicable. From the narrator's vantage point, it would seem that the listener must remember what happened over the length of those years because he was there too. He must also bear the burden of what occurred. He must remember, and he must remember all of it, including what happened in elementary school. In his essay, Unforgivable, Peter Orner discusses the story with reference to an incident at a bridge by William Maxwell. It's a vignette, or story, he says, that has little action, little character development. It's just a voice, really. And in this story, too, as in Rulfo's Remember, the narrator recalls something that occurred years ago. In Maxwell's story, as Orner describes it, it happened among a group of Boy Scouts around age 12. The older boys in the troop decided on hazing the younger members, including Maxie Rabinowitz. While none of the boys is seriously injured in a feat that, quote, knocks the wind out of every one of them, the narrator recalls it as an inexplicable act of violence perpetrated for no reason. Writes Orner, we have all done things we wish we could erase forever from the record. No matter how we airbrush our own histories, the hurt we have caused will always reach out for us. Orner shares an anecdote about the time he hurt the feelings of another boy in the 7th grade. Writes Orner, and God knows I've done a lot worse and a lot more recently. This is the only thing on a long list of things I take back. He adds, this is why Maxwell's story transcends anecdote, because the story refuses any absolution. You live with it. Period. Orner quotes Maxwell's narrator now as an older man who considers that perhaps even those boys who underwent the hazing may not even remember the incident, considering the multitude of things that happen in any person's life. He adds, cruelty could never again take them totally by surprise, but I have remembered it. Writes Orner, what the story does, finally, is instruct the narrator on the nature of his own heart. Here's our discussion of Juan Rulfo's Remember.
And I did have one question. There's a typo in this story, is there not?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
I think on this, well, this is maybe for our discussion, but I think the old translation has this story, has the rhythms of this story better.
You know, I gotta say, man, there's things I like about this one, and we talked about this back like a year ago. I like a lot about this. Stavins and Augenbraun did. But Shade, I think the rhythm, exactly, you just said it, man. He captures Rulfo's rhythm, I think. he might sacrifice some of the strictly textual, literal things.
Yeah.
But he holds on to the rhythm way.
And some of those things, I mean, it's hard to imagine not having them when you look at the new translation. But I mean, going back, first of all, there is no typo in the Shad, which was helpful. And and it just
we're talking about, sorry, are we talking about the her, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Just making sure we're on the same. Yeah, exactly.
Right? I mean, it totally throws off the story.
It does, yeah.
You know,
I lost like half a day yesterday going nuts over that. Like, have I been reading this wrong? You know, like. I
mean, I did look at the original. I don't know if you guys did, but is it the problem? You know, I mean, it's obviously just really sloppy, but it's I believe he uses lay.
I understand why he does it. Like, in a way, it's kind of what's funny is, in a way, it means Stavans bought into the story. In a way, because because that's how Rulfo sets the story up. I mean, how about the fact that he changes the name of one of the characters? We get two names for the sister, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And he really doesn't go into detail about that. And I think it's because of the way it's called Acuérdate to remember. It's talking about memory, you know.
It drove me crazy, but it's clearly, I mean, Rulfo knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
You know.
But going back to the Spanish, yeah, you're right. That's in the Spanish, there's no gender there. There's no way to know. I mean, I'll be honest with you. The first time I read this, I do remember being very confused by the first 3 paragraphs, because it's sort of meandering. It's dropping in all these family members. You're just going, what? Who?
It's totally reasonable to think, and like you say, like saying like the translator went with the rhythm of the story, or went with the kind of got bought into the stories that the guy is. Like this guy is remembering everything about everybody. So, you know, exactly. It's easy to take your eye off the ball if the story's about Urbano because the storyteller does too. So I totally get it. But still, it was a little bit of a frustrating, because it showed that he didn't quite get the story in its totality. You know.
Yeah.
So anyway,
unfortunately, I think so, and it brought out all my insecurities there for a second.
Anyway, I'm glad we're on the same page on that. But Yvette, go ahead. Sorry, I got us off on a tangent right away.
No, that's an important tangent. I think it's not a tangent. I mean, there's a lot in here, as you all are saying, about how memory works. And he's saying, acuérdate, remember. And in fact, you know, at a certain point, we're wondering how reliable his memory is. And you know, that first part, it's just so maddening. The very first you know, who are these people? Why do 2 of them have to be named Urbano, for crying out loud? And I made my little chart again. I always make my little chart with Lima and Urbano Senior and Fidencio, the 2 daughters, and then the nicknames to confound everything even more. So I'm with you.
The chart breaks down at the sister-in-law.
Pretty much.
No. But can I ask a question, Yvette? Because you chose this story, and I'm really glad you did in a lot of ways. And I would like somebody to read the opening graph, because it really is not just maddening, but madcap. You know what I mean? And just like totally hilarious. The hiccup is a riot, as is the haggling over the tomatoes. You know, he does it again in an incredibly dark, sad story. It's also pretty funny. But I'm wondering, Yvette, what drew you to this one?
You know, I was thinking about, I wanted something that I could get close to without being totally destroyed. But then I was destroyed.
That's the one too that Rulfo does right there.
I'm telling you, that's it. So I chose it because I don't remember now, to be honest with you, Peter, but I remember, and I think I wrote to you guys and I said, I like the elasticity and the blank slate of it. And really, I could not have been more wrong. And I've read the story 50 times over the years, right? I don't know. It really hit me a totally different way this go around.
Is it fair to say that, I mean, just going back to how you started this talking about the title itself, that we're talking about remember as in a command.
Oh yeah.
Remember.
This is he wants you. He needs you to remember.
And the you is in the you in this case is somebody who was there for all these events, but doesn't seem to be as obsessed with them as our narrator. Like a friend of mine who might be like, "What, you mean you don't remember when so and so did such and such in 7th grade? What, you don't remember?" Like, that's kind of that's the refrain of the story, and that's what makes it just so. I mean, it's so natural. I mean, this is something that happens, all the time to people. This kind of.
It is, and this conflation of details and names, that's so frustrating. I'm so like if I tell a joke, I always ruin the punchline, like that kind of thing, like this kind of, so it's so confusing and you get ahead of yourself. And it also reminded me of this friend from high school that I had who would always say le dije, le dije. She would tell a story and she was so animated, and she would say, and then I told him, or then I told her, and she would repeat that, and then she would say le dije, te dije, le dije. She would say, like, and I told her, I told you, I told her, right? It's just like this, it's crazy. So they put me in the mind of that. It's just like this, just running at the mouth at this listener, making the assumption that there don't need to be too many context clues because this person was there too, except, yeah, this person's a lot more obsessed than the listener is.
I'd go as far as saying he's burdened by this memory of Urbano, right? I mean that's how it felt like to me, particularly towards the end. I mean, he starts off in a sort of half joking thing, dropping in these funny references about the mom, Berenjena, which it would have to do with the typo there. I believe that's his mom. Mm-hmm. But towards the end, these memories weigh on him, and he needs you to, unburden some of that weight. You, the person he's talking to.
I think that's what hit me totally differently this time. Is I wanted a story where I could have a little bit of distance, not have my emotions simmering in my throat for whatever reason. And for whatever reason, this time, no, it was there. And for precisely the reason you're saying, like, he is burdened by it. He can act all day. Like, no, like maybe it was this way, maybe it was that way. Like there's this kind of just recalling the facts, not adding a lot to it, not so emotionally invested. And then, as you say, Beto, you realize, no, he was, and therefore we are too, then devastated after all.
I got a friend, an old friend who, he's part of a group of friends, and he's dropped away. He's gone, even though we know where he is. And I was thinking, like, we always, every time we're together, we talk about this guy, and we talk, what happened, and I feel like I get the same sense of this narrator is thinking about Urbano, like what happened to Urbano, and as you say, I mean, I don't want to cut to the chase because I think we need to talk about the last paragraph at some point. Also, we don't want to wreck it for people, but the last paragraph hit me so hard, like in that way, like, oh yeah, like there is, like, what, I mean, what was up ultimately, what was up with this guy, and that the same kind of conversations we talk about in terms of what happened to this friend, like he dropped off, what happened, what, and the narrator here knows all the facts, but then he gets to that last fact, and I think he it's like even he can't explain that one, and we're left with it. I was wondering if we could read the first paragraph though, just to give people a sense of what we're dealing with here.
Remember Urbano Gomez, Don Urbano's son, Dimas' his grandson, the one who directed Pastorelas, the Christmas plays, and who died reciting the cursed angel complaint during the time of influence? It's been years since then, maybe 15. But you must remember him. Remember we used to call him El Abuelo, grandfather, because his other son, Fidencio Gomez, had two very playful daughters. one dark and very short, who'd been given the mean nickname of La Remingada, stuck up, and the other one who was towering, who had light blue eyes and who people even said wasn't his, and about whom you can't say much more than she suffered from hiccups. Remember the commotion that broke out when we were in mass, and at the exact moment of the elevation, she had a hiccup attack, which sounded as if she were laughing and crying at the same time, until they took her outside and they gave her a bit of sugar water, and then she calmed down. She ended up marrying Lucio Chico, the owner of the mezcal bar that used to belong to Librado, up the river, where the Teodulos' linseed mill is.
That she married Lucio Chico's got nothing to do with the story.
I mean, the first thing, right? The command, remember Urbano Gomez? Then he goes on to not really talk about Urbano Gomez.
Right, like his grandfather. His grandfather, like, he's the one who did the, those passion plays, right, at Christmas time, right? There's another typo, the time of the influence.
Yeah, I can kind of see why he did that. Because in the original, I don't want to fall into this hole of talking about the translations because I have way too much to say, but
it says influencia.
Right, but in Spanish, Rulfo is adopting the kind of mistake that, I mean, later on he does it too with the word paralysis in Spanish.
Ah, okay.
He's like, in Spanish it's incorrect, right? Grammatically it's incorrect, but it's what somebody from like a rural small town would say. In fact, there was a politician that said influencia instead of influenza a couple years ago, and he was mocked a lot for it.
It's hard because time of the influence, I thought, had some other meaning.
Right. And
so it's hard. It's a tough one in English to pull that off.
Hard. I would have gone with the influence, maybe thrown in an article in there just to keep the mistake, but make it obvious that it's talking about the disease.
Yeah, I mean, just being in a pandemic right now, you don't want to get that. You don't want a reader to not get that this is the time of the flu.
Spanish flu.
But anyway, it's a.
I thought that's why Yvette had picked it.
But you know what I love about it is what you're saying, that he's adopting the malapropism, right? Like this crazy Norm Crosby, kind of a malapropism. And your example about what was the mistake the person made recently, Beto, that you said?
Yeah, instead of saying influenza, saying influencia, yeah, right?
There was like a Chilean, I can't remember, there was a story about a Chilean leader who said, buenas noches televisores, or something like that, instead of televidentes, or, so that I just find it so funny that, it's line 3. It's the third line of the story where we're already with Urbano Gomez and Don Urbano and the abuelo and the plays, the pastorelas, and this cursed angel complaint, and then this mistake. And so, I can imagine somebody reading this and Googling time of influence. Why not? Somebody might.
I mean, again, I don't want to knock the translators, or we should give, we're on Texas Public Radio, we should give some props to University of Texas Press for keeping this book alive for 60 years in English in 2 different translations, and commissioning a new translation where I'm sure there wasn't a lot of money in it. So I get it. I could have used I like notes at the back. Now, I don't want a footnote ever, but I'm just saying, like, some contextual notes might have been appropriate here. But the bottom,
I agree.
But again, the bottom line is about this first paragraph is how much is in it. It's so thick with, like, we talked last time and a couple times, Yvette, didn't we? Just about, kind of Rulfo and the idea of silence and, kind of, he didn't have a lot to say, and then I was thinking about that. Like, you take this story, this guy's bursting with stuff to say, so there's no reticence here. There's no kind of this, like, almost cliche about Rulfo is that he didn't talk much. We've done a couple of two stories in a row where we have narrators who won't shut up. The story's only 5 pages, but it's a thick 5 pages. And the paragraph that Beto read was so like thick with incident and with names and with, it just pulls you right in to the universe that these guys are a part of, or presumably guys.
And I like that ambiguity of it. He's so precise in his details, and then you're still not exactly sure he's remembering, or he's redirecting our focus for whatever reason. I mean, I think we can guess, but so that also draws me in. The weird humor, this thing with the language, the thing with all of the people, the hiccups. I mean, it's sort of like, there are some things that you want to sort of zoom out on and focus on to develop a little bit, and that ain't it, except it is. It's kind of perfect that he would move our attention to that. And then of course, later, our attention moves to this terrible situation of the mother scavenging for food, or both the industriousness and the sort of cheating ways of Urbano with his schoolmates. It's like you're not sure. This is kind of weird. It's hard to believe. He doesn't seem very certain, and then there's all this detail. So there's a lot of richness in that part of the story for me too.
Yeah, I thought, and again, it starts trying to describe Urbano, goes into the grandfather, goes into the cousins. Second paragraph goes into the mom. Again, still not yet on Urbano, right? He starts talking about the mom, La Berenjena, which, just by the way, on the side, do you guys realize? Do you guys know why she got that nickname? No, I'm just curious because it comes from a saying. I'm just making
the eggplant.
Tell me this. Tell us.
Because she's pregnant a lot.
That might be it, but there's a really famous this is just from bringing from my own background knowledge.
Tell us.
Yeah, there's a dicho, there's a saying that te metiste en un berenjenal, like when you get into problems, is that you went into the berenjena plant, into the eggplant plant, because apparently the leaves cause not lesions but some kind of rash of the plant. So there's this saying that people say about the eggplant plant, La Berenjena. And so, because if you read, he's literally saying how she always gets into problems, particularly in the Spanish version, in the original text, metida en líos. So it goes hand in hand there. It's almost kind of jokey though. As he's saying the story, the narrator, there's this sort of, like I said earlier, this kind of jokey tone in his way of telling that really changes by the end. But anyway, that was just something there.
Interesting. I did not know that dicho.
Yeah. And then apparently, again, kind of jokey, very sad though. She goes broke from paying for the funerals of her children that die. Because she serves everybody canela, or I think the translation doesn't actually translate cinnamon, canela. It just says she paid for the drinks, right? Mm-hmm. Because of the drinks she gave to those attending the wake. Again, something that's kind of funny, because usually what people do at these funerals is you serve cinnamon tea, canela, and they'll spike the tea with booze. So it's like the cinnamon is expensive, but so is the booze. But people basically, it's another excuse for a party, right? So it's sort of saying she went broke from kind of partying or throwing these festive occasions for her dead children. Again, just very dark humor kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it shows, again, what Rulfo, I mean, making jokes about dead kids is not exactly something you can generally pull off. But Rulfo's happy. I mean, maybe not a joke, but it clearly, like, she went broke because of, the alcohol she bought at her kids' funerals. That's not funny, sadly, right?
And also paying the church so that they would send a choir to sing songs, right? Things like that.
I mean, it makes you want to cry, but also you can't help but laugh. I mean, not to be all professorial. So the Chekhov story, Rothschild's Fiddle, he makes a similar move about, there's a coffin maker, and he doesn't want to make kids coffins because they, he doesn't make as much money. He doesn't think about the fact that he's making coffin for a dead kid. It's that he doesn't. It's a similar sort of gallows humor that both writers aren't afraid of, because people aren't afraid of those kind of jokes.
Exactly. Especially, I mean, we hear it from the narrator. These, people from these rural areas, these small towns, they live, with death as a very present thing. You have to joke about that which you have to face every day, the sadness that you see every day. So I think it keeps very true to the time and place of this. I mean, they're just coming out of the Spanish flu epidemic at the time too. We're a few years after that, right? And right after that came the Cristero War. Most of these stories in this book are set around the time of the Cristero War, sometime after that in the 30s during Lázaro Cárdenas' presidency, and even Luvina. We talked about how they, in a way, maybe I pushed too hard on the no time and place thing with Luvina, because I was thinking even in this one, by the first sentence, Rulfo gives us a very specific time, the flu. And in Luvina, he gave us the educational reforms of Lázaro Cárdenas. So you pretty much always know what decade you're in.
What do you make of the quotation marks around "to sweeten her children's mouths"? There are quotation marks around that in that section about her scavenging for food.
Basically food that's already been thrown out and half cooked.
Like, who is he quoting? Who did he hear? Was it some adult when he was a kid? Like, why is she doing that? Well, to sweeten her children's mouth. No, I was just going to say, like, that would be impressive to a kid, I think.
She doesn't raise her children, right? She dies when she has the second child. Mm-hmm. So I would assume it was something that an adult saw her do and then told our narrator. A lot of this stuff, are things I'm assuming that the narrator has sort of been told or heard, right? Because he's the age of Urbano.
I'm glad you're saying that, because I kept thinking about this go around about the telephone game, right? And the way that information the expression of it is corrupted every time you tell it again. How so much of this is, retelling and thinking back, and kind of sounds like he's told the story before. So I wondered about that. I wondered, like, how much of it is he retelling, right? That it's become sort of part of the lore of the town. And everybody should remember it. Acuérdate, right? Although this particular person seems, as Peter said, really obsessed with it. And as you said, really burdened by it.
And I think for me, it's there's a big change there, as I perceived it in the tone of the story. After he describes Urbano's a business-like personality of always, selling things that he got cheaper, more expensive to them, and he's almost annoyed at the fact that they all bought things from him, and he sold whatever he had in his pockets. He raffled off all kinds of junk he would find in his pockets. I got them marbles, tops, and spinners, and even green beetles, the kind you tie a thread to one of its legs so it doesn't fly too far.
I love that.
Yeah, those are actually they're going extinct. They're kind of disappearing. It's very sad. But it seems that he's almost annoyed, that they all bought into this. And I felt very sympathetic towards Urbano in this kind of scene, because he's just trying to get his nut. This kid, his mom died. His mom didn't raise him. Don Urbano, his father, essentially just gave him his name. That's all he gave him. He never shows up again. He comes in the first line of the story, and then we never hear back from him. So this kid has nothing, and he's just trying to make whatever money he can. And the narrator is saying how, well, he basically was ripping them all off, or something to that extent. And then he comes that line on page 89. Maybe he turned bad then, or maybe he was that way from birth, because they all used to just go see his sister who sold tepache, drink, and not want to pay, right? So they're really the ones that were ripping him off. They didn't want to pay his sister for the tepache, which she had to sell to sustain her husband because because he went dumb, apparently feeble-minded.
I mean, because that's where the story, we can make an argument that this is where the story starts. I mean, the first page, two and a half pages are really prelude to maybe he turned bad then, or maybe he was that way from birth. He was thrown out of school, and then here's the Urbano story, which is actually shorter than the intro. But I mean, this is how my mother tells stories. She'll meet someone in the grocery store and she'll tell me about it, and it'll be the detour upon detour upon detour before we get to what the woman told her at the grocery store. And so it just feels like, that Rulfo just is so aware that stories aren't from point A to point whatever. That they're incredibly susceptible to the whim of where the storyteller wants to go, because it's so vivid in his mind. I mean, and there's so much in the beginning of the story that, like you said, Nachito Revere's brother-in-law, the guy who got himself feeble-minded a few days after getting married, and whose wife Inez, to support herself, had to set up a tepache stand at the main road's sentry points, while Nachito would spend his time playing songs that were always out of tune on a mandolin he borrowed from Don Refugio's barbershop.
That's so good.
If the mandolin didn't return at the end, and of course it does, right? And not to be crafty, and I cannot. And that's not somebody who likes to talk about
Let's get crafty, Peter. Let's do it.
Yeah, right. Well, but I mean, just sometimes when you're writing a story, right, and you realize, oh wait, what about that mandolin? You know what I mean? and then it comes back with, but it's so brilliant and so, we're never going to get in Rulfo's mind to know how he ultimately, uses the mandolin in this story, where that idea came from. Probably it came from something real. That's what I assume. But just the fact that he sort of, that he puts it out there in the barbershop early on is just remarkable. I was looking up some things about him, and he was very interested in American literature, very interested in European literature, very interested in Nordic literature, particularly Knut Hamsun from Norway. And but he objects to he likes a lot of Italian literature, but he objects at one point in this lecture he gives, saying that they just, nothing's happening. He wants something to happen, and it just made me think about, in all of his stories, something really does happen, and certainly something happens in this story. So it's not, I think he wasn't all literary, it wasn't all sort of heady. This is, shit goes down, and things, these people are doing things that are memorable enough for many years later for our narrator to, insist that his friend remember.
I was just quickly about Rulfo. I was reading through some of his letters, just getting ready for this talk. And speaking of him liking literature from all over, I found a line he wrote in English the letters are to his wife, Clara. And it's just to share him writing in English, because I thought it was cool. I am hurry because finished me the ink, he writes at the end of one of the letters.
That's great.
Yeah.
You should translate that.
Cartas a Clara. I mean, that'd be awesome.
Because I've heard about this book. It's sort of a legendary book, right? And I mean, we don't have access to it. You should call Texas Press right now and tell them.
I'll send them the proposal. Yeah. Could I share another small thing of my background?
Yes.
With the story. So the brother-in-law, Nachito, who gets feeble-minded, reminded me of this thing my mom once told me. My father brought over a friend of his to the house, a buddy of his that worked dad worked at a maquiladora. So they came, I guess, after work, and the friend saw this plant growing in the garden, a plant called tolvache, right? And the friend starts laughing And my mom is there and she says, why are you laughing? This plant's just growing in the garden. It's this sort of weed-like plant. I think it has flowers. And he's like, and he says to my mom, you know, are you entolachando your husband or what? And she's just kind of like, what do you mean? And entolachar means when you give somebody tea made out of tolvache or a drink made out of tolvache, because it's supposed to sort of make people dumb men so that they then fall in love with the women, right? Like the woman would give it to a man. And apparently it is a thing where it causes brain lesions or something like that. So it just was interesting to me. I don't know if he's sort of alluding to that here or there's some kind of witchcrafty thing going on with the story, because then there was also that moment with the girl getting the hiccup attack at the elevation when the priest brings up the body of Christ, you know, and the girl like can't take it and she gets the hiccups. But then again, I was thinking maybe she's just a little girl and it's mass in the 19 teens and or the 20s, I guess. And she's bored because the priest doesn't even look at the people. He has his back towards the people and they're speaking in Latin. So she probably just wants to get out of there and pretend she has the hiccups and she gets sugar water, right? I don't know. So some interesting things there.
That brings us, I think, to Urbano gets the shit beat out of him by his uncle after he's caught with his cousin, you know, in a dry cistern playing husband and wife. And then he's marched out of school in humiliation. This is all after the line you mentioned earlier. Maybe he turned bad then, or maybe he was that way from birth. And then here's the Urbano story. The Urbano story is that it starts out, he's with his cousin, they get caught, they both get marched out of school, and there's this incredible line about her, where
La remendada.
Yes.
About her eyes?
About so he is marched out of school and he kind of, you know, typically says, you know, you'll pay dearly for this. And then Rulfo has a new paragraph. Then it was her turn. And she came out pouting like her eyes were looking daggers at people. And when she reached the door, she let out a sob, a screech you were hearing all afternoon as if it were the howl of a coyote. It's just remarkable. You were hearing all afternoon. I mean, I think here's where the translator, I would really give them a lot of props for.
This is where you know this is where you know translation is an imperfect art, because this paragraph I was really focusing on it on the new one, because he really picked out the not just the humiliation she's feeling, but the anger. That in the original there's this sort of synecdoche, and it does that with her eyes. It says raspando los ladrillos, like scraping the bricks, you know, the bricks on the floor. Here it's translated to daggers at the people, which, you know, works, I think, to communicate that anger for me. But just, it's something that I totally glossed over because I read that sentence so many times. And I was rereading it, preparing for this, and it sort of stood out to me. And I was like, what do you mean, you know, scraping those bricks on the floor? It's just, I started to pick up on, there's a lot of anger here. And she has a lot of agency here, La Remendada. She's not just some victim, you know.
Except that the story is really not about her. It's almost incidental. And yet he pauses and says the next line, unless your memory is really faulty, you have to remember that. You know, it's it just, I mean, this is what I mean. Like, stories are coming out of this guy's ears. And so, you know, it's Urbano, like we're kind of channeling into what happened to Urbano. But along the way, like you say, I agree. I mean, this moment is maybe the most, you know, most memorable in the whole story.
Well, he really slows down for it, right? I mean, he really gives us the scene. They parade them. I mean, they don't just send them out. They parade them. They make a, what does it say? They yanked him by the ears to the main door while everyone laughed, making him walk through a row of boys and girls to embarrass him.
And then his uncle beats him up to a point of him almost being paralyzed. So it's like, you know, I mean, this is, you know, what happened to Urbano is this, you know, his uncle beats him up to a point of, you know, him probably not being able to walk. He's got a limp at the end. I'm sure it's from that, you know, but of course we're not dealing with a great guy here, right? As is, you know, he comes back and you know, he's reincarnated. He leaves town after that. And he comes back in a sentence, really. He comes back as a cop. And then.
But he comes back after truth is. And
after what, sorry?
after the words truth is.
Yeah.
Truth is, we didn't see him. The paragraph right before that, it starts with people say. People say. So I'm interested in marking where he's saying acuerda, remember, and where he's saying something along the lines of people say, and something along the lines of the truth is.
Yeah.
So because it's there in this line that Peter just read, we didn't see him again until he showed up. You know, I'm going to prick up my ears, and not that I'm not, you know, all the way through, especially in reading this in December of 2020, but yeah, I'm paying extra close attention in all of this. What was true, right? What was absolutely certain, or at least truer than everything else that we've just gone through.
And I mean, Rulfo is, you know, I promise not to be hyperbolic, but then I'm always hyperbolic. But the amount of things he's trying within just a few paragraphs, like you say, I mean, it's such a, I love that, Yvette, like, you know, that what he personally witnessed, what he heard other people say, and then like what is objectively true, you know, which is, and here's where we are, this supposedly objectively true. Objectively true is he comes back as a cop, and then, you know,
Of all things.
yeah, which, you know, which means all kinds of things in the context of this time and place, to get back to that idea. But I do think that that these stories are as universal as they come, because, you know, we all know the people who come back to town changed and what they end up doing.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I'm thinking about, I don't know, people from my childhood who went through something traumatic in the moment, that in the moment you feel like, wow, they can never recover from that. And it's not the end all, you know, regañada. It's not the end. It's not the worst thing that's ever happened to me, right? It was a moment there that, I don't know, I feel like there was this shared, not trauma, but this shared impact of what they witnessed, even the ones that were maybe jeering at the two kids, you know, having to be humiliated and marched out of there. There's just something of and I think that's where the emotion of the story comes for me, is the things that occur when we're young that we think will mark us for life. They really don't. But that, you know, we convince ourselves. And then in this telephone game and in this lore of the town, it's the thing you can never live down. You know, I think that's very realistic. And I think it's too bad. But I think it's a very realistic thing. Like the things that mark you for life.
Maybe put it this way, or another way of, like, the things that mark you for life when other people are telling your story. I mean, in this case, you know, in here, what happens is something happens when he's in 5th grade, and a few sentences later, you know, which is a lot of years, because you don't go from 5th grade to being a police officer, right? Anywhere, right? And so, you know, there's the kind of radical, like, compression in that. But, you know, in our story, in the guy who's telling us the story, is that's how it goes. What happened in 5th grade influenced the man he returns to town as.
And going back to that line, you know, was he always bad from birth? I feel in a way he says that to, again, unburden himself. Yeah, as if I had no participation in the way the town treated him, you know. Because again, even when he says, oh, he left town, it says he was so mad he left town. Well, was he so mad he left town, or did they kind of run him out or humiliate him to the point where he had no place there? It seems it's always our narrator, he's always sort of washing his hands of participating in ostracizing this boy at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And again, he's not this is by no means an angel, right? Urbano, but there's a lot of I guess we talked about it already, but really not wanting to admit any kind of involvement in the treatment of Urbano, or that the treatment was unfair or messed up in any way.
But even though the chronology here is not a straight line, right? We're with the feeble-minded Nachito. It's fifth grade. It's now this guy's a policeman, right? We're all over the map. But I feel like there are some assumptions being made here that move from truth is we didn't see him again to that's when he killed his brother-in-law. I don't necessarily see a line from there to there, but in a retelling and another retelling and another retelling, this is the way people have connected the dots. And this is my 2020 reading of it. Okay, so this is where I went, like, no, it wasn't that. It wasn't a cause and effect thing for me this time. I mean, there's something very sad about reading it that way, and then there, for me, it just seems like it makes sense to me that this anger and rage that led to this situation with the brother-in-law, I'm not necessarily seeing it in a line.
Because there isn't any, and that's, and again, not to overblow things, but that's what makes the guy we're talking about today, better than almost anybody who's ever done this that I've ever read. I mean, now I just completely violated every rule I've ever seen.
So glad you did.
But you're right. Causality is, he throws causality out the window between even the hiccups and the lifting the body. Like, what's the deal there? Or the feeble-minded brother-in-law and getting married and becoming feeble-minded. What's the causality there? And then this too. It happens all over the place.
No scholar in the universe is going to tell me why he decides to kill his brother-in-law just because his brother-in-law decided to come over and serenade him. I mean, the guy's obviously completely bananas, right? And yet, that's thinking back, like, we have this storyteller who's just connecting these things that aren't connectable, and because I think it's Rulfo knew how, like you were saying, Yvette. I mean, that this is absolutely how people tell stories. It's also how people experience things that aren't connected, but they happened.
I mean,
so how do you talk about them?
Look at that. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't say hello to anyone. I mean, just those two sentences. First, he didn't speak to anyone. He didn't say hello to anyone. That's the way people talk. It makes no sense, and yet we totally get it, right? So yeah, yes.
Not to go back on this unreliable narrator thing too much there, Peter, but the way he sets it up is so perfect and cinematic. I don't know what you want to call it. They're playing the bells for the souls in the purgatory when he does this. It's almost the women are inside praying the rosary. Or the people, I believe it says. Yeah, the people praying in the rosary in church came running and saw them there. Nachito legs up, defending himself with a mandolin, and Urbano hitting him again and again with the butt of his mauser, like hearing what people were shouting at him. Rabbit like a dog from hell.
I mean, it's so violent. I mean, so brutal.
Right, he doesn't shoot him. He beats him with the butt of the rifle.
And wouldn't it have made more sense for him to go back and kill his uncle, who beat him up? Right, that would have been there where you would have had the cause and effect. No, instead he kills the feeble-minded mandolin player, who's his brother-in-law, and every other writer in the universe would have had some reason, maybe some kind of thing with the sister, something, and maybe that was there, and the narrator doesn't know or doesn't care to tell us in this moment or whatever, but it's just so almost gratuitous. But then, I mean, the story doesn't end there, and I hate to wreck it for people, and I hope we acknowledge that we can do that here. But
spoiler alert,
the ending really does prove like almost the opposite of what I was just saying, because the end really truly is like, now I understand why we were here. It's not random. it's not random why this guy is, and as you started this, Beto, saying he's burdened by the story, and ultimately, I think it is the end of Urbano that makes him want to tell the story again and again. You know, that this somebody who would literally tie the noose of their own rope, you know, when they're going to be hung for what they've done.
Well, it's interesting, just going off what you just said there, it just occurred to me that in a way, as he's talking about the mandolin and the scene where he beats him to death, it's not as if he blames Nachito, but it throws a bit of like, you know, why did it occur to him? You know, it occurred to Nachito to go and serenade him when it was already nighttime, as if doing that was what made Urbano snap, and Nachito had some kind of blame for that. It's an interesting way of phrasing it from our narrator. Again, like he's trying to make sense of it, or trying to give it that causality, right? But yeah, I agree with that ending, right? Just he needs you to remember this.
Like in any sort of kind of studies of fiction or whatever, you kind of want, you know, in order to feel for Nachito's pain, it would have been nice for us to know him in the first place. But Rulfo doesn't care about that. He does introduce him earlier, but it's not like we spend any time with this guy and then suddenly his legs are up, he's defending himself. I mean, it's graphically, you know, I mean, it's like action for pure action's sake, without, you know, until of course then the final shift in the story. But it's nuts what he does in this story. I'm so glad you called attention to it, Yvette, because I don't think I spent enough time with this story in the past.
I definitely had not. I mean, even in that scene, there's a detail that it really jumped out at me now, that until some guy who wasn't even from around here came out of the crowd and went and took the rifle from him and hit him on the back with it, who was not even from here. So everybody from the town is just kind of watching these people that they know because they're from the town. They've known Nachito probably their whole lives, and they're just watching him get beat to death.
That's the point that always reminds me of the short story, The Blue Hotel. So this idea of every sin is a collaboration. Every sin is a collaboration, or every murder is maybe it's every sin is a collaboration.
Right, a beautiful line. Even if it's not right, it's a beautiful line. You're talking about, is Stephen Crane?
Yeah. So that the Swede and the card game and the cowboy, and the cowboy was cheating, and then the Swede accuses him of cheating, and so the Swede is killed, and then the Easterner stands up and says, we're all responsible for this death. I knew the cowboy was cheating and I said nothing, and so and then he says, whatever the line is, every sin is a collaborate. And then there's this weird line about it's always the fault of 40 women, whatever that means. I never figured out what that one meant. But this always comes to me as I feel like, and I'm probably 100% wrong, but this idea of you must remember him since we were classmates at school and you knew him just as much as I did. And what Beto was pointing to is these people in the town knew the story, knew him, and it takes this other guy to come out and do something about it. And so it's like this happens a lot, I think, in childhood or in peer groups, or I don't know, in small towns and communities. It's like all of these things are happening all around us, and some of them are pretty terrible. And sometimes they just keep going on just as a matter of routine, and because nobody ever put a stop to it, whatever that might be. So I feel like, here's this poor woman with all her dead children scavenging in the garbage. And here's this feeble-minded guy, and here's this terrible story of this place, this brotherhood of humanity versus, a godless universe, right? Like, not to get too deep into it, but it's like, who can do anything to to stop the gears. Who's ever going to do anything? Well, life doesn't work that way. Life does not work that way. And short fiction doesn't work that way, right? Fiction doesn't work that way. This, whatever this narrator is doing to give us the story, all out of order, not chronologically, blowing the punchline, whatever, is the story. This is what we must remember, and that's all we have. But the idea of you should remember this to this listener who's complicit, perhaps, because it's a collaboration. Well, what do we do as readers? What's the ideal of, not to get to the ideal of courage, right? In this discussion of brotherhood of humanity, what is the ideal of courage in the face of abject poverty, and just, things, the wheels falling off of your freaking life at every turn, and there's nothing you can do to stop it?
I think you're right. I was thinking about this, how he returns as a policeman belonging to an institution where in his life all institutions had failed this boy. I mean, what's that thing? It takes a village to raise a child, something like that. The church failed this kid, the school failed this kid, the townspeople, no one really, right? Nobody really picked up for this kid. And I keep going back to this thing where he was selling, the naranjas con chile, the mangoes. He was trying to get his nut. He's trying to do his thing, and even the friends around him, seem to just be using him. The thing where they didn't want to pay for the tepache. But I think, sort of going off what you were talking about there, that's kind of what I picked up from that.
But nothing, even that. I keep going back to like what a lesser writer would do with all of that. They might gin it up to a point where we do actually feel like, oh, well, he was, we're not going to excuse the violence, but we can understand it, right? It's not understandable what he does to this brother-in-law.
Oh no.
And I just think that's what's so just so surprising and brilliant about it, and I think tethered to what it's like out there.
Juan Rulfo is the author of Acuérdate from the collection El Llano en Llamas. It's translated in the collection The Plain in Flames by Ilan Stavans and Harold Augenbraum. It's published by the University of Texas Press. Alberto Reyes Morgan is a graduate of the MFA program for writers at Warren Wilson College. He's written and translated for the Voices of Witness Oral History book series titles Solito Solita, Crossing Borders with Youth Refugees from Central America, Underground America, Narratives of Undocumented Lives, and others. His story, Salt, was published in the fall 2020 issue of the Michigan Quarterly Review. The essay Unforgivable by Peter Orner appears in the Memoir and Essays Am I Alone Here? Peter Orner is also the author of 5 other books, including the story collection Maggie Brown and Others. He holds the professorship in English and creative writing at Dartmouth College. This has been The Lonely Voice with Peter Orner from Book Public on Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Bree Kirkham is our digital producer. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.